Okay, well, thanks for joining this webinar this afternoon. I'm going to be looking at, I know the new normal isn't everybody's favourite phrase, particularly right now because of everything that's sort of changing almost on a week-by-week basis with the coronavirus pandemic, but this one's called GDPR and the new normal and how it impacts your business. And more importantly, the GDPR implications, and that's going to be the focus of the session. It's due to run for an hour. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but as I've already said, feel free to ask questions as we go through the chat function, and I'll try and pick those up as we go through, so I'll keep an eye on those as they come in. Otherwise, there's a session towards the end, so we should have some time if need be. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know me, just to introduce myself, my name is Mark Gracey. My business is Mark Gracey GDPR and does exactly what it says on the tin, in that I support businesses with their GDPR compliance. I'll talk a bit more about what that means towards the end, but I've been involved in data protection for quite some time. GDPR obviously in the last four or so years, but I was a data protection manager back when the 1998 Data Protection Act came in, and have been involved in regulatory and compliance roles, particularly in the internet and telecoms industry, pretty much nearly since 1998, 1999. So today we're going to cover GDPR and the implications of how your business may be adapting, or the organization you're working with is adapting to the global pandemic, with obviously a clear slant on the GDPR implications of that. So I'm going to do a very quick recap of GDPR. I don't have enough time to go through it in a lot of detail. So there is a bit of an assumption that you understand the background of what GDPR is all about. We'll be looking at what the challenge is, and some of the steps that you can take right now to make sure you're on the right compliance track. And then, as I said, if needs be, there's some time for Q&A at the end. So let's kick off with a quick recap of GDPR. This is a slide I use quite a lot, so apologies if you've been along to a talk before and seen this. It's basically a one-slide summary of the key elements of GDPR. So just to clarify, when we talk about GDPR, GDPR protects personal data. Personal data is any data that you can identify an individual with, either directly, because it clearly is an identifiable piece of information, or indirectly if you have other data that enables you to identify this apparent non-personal data, and you've had to identify individuals in it. So potentially both pots of data would be personal data. And the thing that some people don't realize is that it literally means any identifiable person. It doesn't matter whether they're a consumer, a customer, an employee in another business, your own employees, your suppliers, or whatever. If you can identify the person, GDPR applies. We have a set of rules which are called the principles, which set out what you can and can't do with data protection. So there's things like fairness, lawfulness, transparency, only process the data for special purpose, only retain it for as long as you have a lawful reason to do so, and so forth. And there's some additional rules about processing data outside the European Economic Area, which, if anybody's been following what's been going on in the exciting world of GDPR and privacy compliance, will know that Privacy Shield, which is the mechanism by which you can process data in the US, if the organizations in the US doing the processing are signed up to Privacy Shield is being deemed invalid. So there's some exciting changes afoot as to what that actually means in reality. If you go to my website, there's a blog article all about it. And in fact, I ran a webinar last week, I think it was, or maybe the week before. And you can watch a recording of that webinar if you want to know a bit more about that. We have the lawful bases. One of these lawful bases has to apply to any bit of your processing activity. So you might process some data for multiple reasons, and a lawful basis has to apply for these multiple reasons, and any bit of processing you do has to have a lawful basis. The ones that most people are familiar with are consent, for example, where you need permission to process the data, or legitimate interest. There's some complexities around making sure you choose the right lawful basis, but as I say, unfortunately, I haven't got much time to go through that. But whenever you're processing data, and even in the context of what you might be doing differently right now because of coronavirus, you need to make sure you've got an appropriate lawful basis for that kind of processing that you may be carrying out. There are individual rights. These are the rights of the data subjects, so the individuals whose personal data that you're processing. The well-known ones are the top two there: right to be informed, which is what gives us the need for a privacy policy. So that's explaining and being open and transparent as required by the principles about what you're doing with personal data, why it's lawful, how long you keep it, and all those kind of things. And the subject access right, which is a request from the data subject saying, do you have my data? If so, I want you to explain what you do with it and where you got it from, and provide a copy. You have to provide that for free within a month. And then there's some other ones. The right to erase or the right to be forgotten, as it's also called, was quite a high-profile one when GDPR came in, because everybody thought they were going to be inundated by people telling them to delete their data. And then that last bubble there, accountability. Accountability is actually one of the data protection principles, but it's a significant part of GDPR. It's the bits that requires you to prove that you are GDPR compliant. And it ranges from things like, if required by law, you might need to have a data protection officer. You need to have documentary evidence of your processing. So you have a record of processing activity, which includes what kind of data you process, why it's lawful to do so, where you process it, where in the world it's being processed, what systems you use, how you keep the data, and all those kind of things. The need for policies and training, and things like third-party due diligence and contracts, dealing with breaches, and the concept of data protection by design and default, which is all about taking data protection at the beginning of any kind of new way of processing. And we'll touch on DPIA, data protection impact assessments, as we go through the following slides, because of all of the tools that you should have in your arsenal of compliance, data protection impact assessments really are your best friend, because they are the risk assessment tools that identify the risks, and you want to be able to identify those so you can mitigate them and have documentary evidence to say that you've considered the risk from that processing. But we'll come on to that in a second. So in a very quick nutshell, that's GDPR. So where does this fit into the lives we find ourselves living right now? I think the biggest challenge for this new normal way of working is the top circle there on the screen. We've had this panic period, certainly in the UK, where we were told we had to go lockdown. Nobody's allowed to go to work. If you can work, you must do it from home. You can't go out unless you need medicine. You need to help somebody who's in need, or you need to get essential food, or those kind of things. And that meant that businesses had to adapt really quickly to and literally, sort of overnight almost, to working in a completely different way. So there was an element of businesses doing their best under the circumstances. We're now, 4 months, 5 months since lockdown came. Things are beginning to be released, although obviously Boris put a pause on some of the things that should have happened last weekend, but things are getting closer to some kind of normality, nowhere near where things were before the coronavirus came. But that also means that we should now be thinking about this new way of working, not being we're doing our best under the circumstances, to we did our best under the circumstances, but right now we're doing as much as we can to get things absolutely absolutely right. So it's going to become increasingly unlikely that there will be sympathy for non-compliance going forward. Although at the moment, the ICO's, the Information Commissioner's Office's current statement on it is that they are taking into consideration a changing set of circumstances and the implications that might have. So there might be a bit more flexibility if you can't deal with a subject access request, or report a breach within the timelines required, and so forth. So ultimately, my point there is doing your best is no longer good enough. You're going to have to make sure going forward that you get your GDPR compliance right. I did quite a lot of writing about this at the time in March and April, and there's a link in the little blue square on the top left there, which will take you to some resources that might help you to sort of back up what we're going to be covering today. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is the fact that we're moving forward, things are changing, and we need to look at how GDPR fits into that. And those key things I've summarised in 4 particular areas, and we'll go through each of those in a second. One, you've either got employees working from home right now because of the fact that you're allowing them to work from home during the pandemic, or because you've now decided that actually you can run your business that way, and employees working from home is a good way forward for your business and keeps your employees happy and all those kind of things. In fact, in the news today, they're talking about a lot of people looking to move into out of urban areas into the countryside, so that they can have a better way of life, because they've realised they've sort of readjusted their way of living in coronavirus and reviewed it and want to work and live differently. So that may be a long-term thing, that more businesses allow people to work from home. We're communicating in different ways. We're sat here today on Zoom. Zoom seems to be the go-to video conferencing platform of choice, but obviously others are available, and we're using video conferencing much more. So there's some issues around just bearing in mind some of the privacy risks, particularly there. Businesses may be adapting and changing the way they're working, not just because they've now got employees working from home and might be looking to do that more permanently, but they might be, another buzzword during the lockdown particularly was businesses pivoting to adjust to this new situation. So their current business isn't working quite as it could because of the lockdown, so they've adjusted the way they're doing it. So it's pubs not being able to open but providing a takeaway food service as an alternative, for example. And then just to sort of throw it in as well, to sort of complete the circle of challenges, I've added in, and I've got a slide to discuss the back to office and the testing scenario if you're getting people coming actually back to the office, and what does that mean from a GDPR compliance point of view if you're recording data about your employees, you're testing their temperature or whatever you might be doing to try and make your workplace as secure as possible. So those are the transition from doing your best to doing it better is, I think, the key challenge, but I'm going to focus on those other 4 scenarios that fit into this new normal and the different way that we're working right now. So let's move on to working from home. So as I said, this could be because you're still under the circumstances allowing employees to work from home, or it could be that actually because of allowing employees to work from home, you've realised that that's what they would like to do more regularly, whether that's part-time or full-time, and there's quite a lot of, there's been some press coverage of businesses saying actually we probably won't go back to the office, we'll work remotely, and there's certainly, I work with businesses who have always been remote workers, and that's internationally, not just across one country. So it's not it's not a new thing, but you do need to consider, if you're looking at doing this more longer term, or you're still enabling your employees while the uncertainty of the pandemic continues, allow them to work from home, and you should really be thinking, if you haven't already, about what those GDPR risks could be. So first up, how are they working from home? I think the time has gone now where it may be acceptable to be video conferencing in using a laptop where you've got your family running around behind you, or things like that. But it's as much about what devices are being used. If your employees are using their own devices, you have less control over the security of the data, the actual use of the device. Where if you supply work-related devices, then they will be or can be configured to give you the controls, so you can put in place virtual private networks to so that they can access work servers and computers remotely through a secure connection, or you can implement remote wipes of hard drives and things like that, or mobile devices should something if it gets stolen or lost. So think about how your employees are working from home. If they're using their own devices, then how can you control the circumstances by which they use that? You need to be mindful about who might be using the device as well. Do they log out of their work email or their work systems before they let their partner or their children or somebody that they live with access the computer and the device for their own purposes, who else is getting access to the data, who's listening, all those kind of things. Because strictly speaking, if you're working on a customer database and somebody's looking over your shoulder who shouldn't be looking over your shoulder, that is a data breach. So technically you would have to consider what the risk is and so forth. And so, yeah, think very carefully about how people are working from home, whether that's a device or an appropriate workspace. The key thing though is thinking about the security of your data. How do you protect your business data when people are working remotely in different situations? And that kind of goes back to the previous point, whether that's a different devices, I mean their own device versus work devices, or in a working environment that doesn't quite work with regards to other people that might be around them. And that's as much about making sure people log out of their systems, that they understand that they shouldn't be downloading data onto their computer, and if they do, don't print it out and leave it on the printer, and all these kind of things. And the problem that some businesses have with remote workers is that the technology and the security they implement is so strict that it kind of sort of fails them in terms of their usability, and you get people emailing customer data or their business data to their Gmail account so that they can just print it out on their own computer. You want to try and avoid those kind of situations, so put scenarios in place with the technology that work for everybody, but also just be mindful, or make sure your employees are mindful that they need to think about the security of that. Carrying out a data protection impact assessment is a key way of really addressing the how and the security. If you carry out a data protection impact assessment, it's basically a risk assessment. What risks are being created by working from home? How do I mitigate those risks? And then being able to implement them. So that's a very top-down overview of the risks, and you should be carrying one of these out to for your working from home process, so that you understand and identify what risks could happen from the processing, be they the technology that's being used, how you're going to make sure your employees maintain security of data at all times. And on the subject of employees, probably the key thing is tell your employees, be quite blunt about it, provide a summary. And one of the resources I've got is a 6-point infographic that you can print out and send to your employees, or email to them for free. And it basically reminds them that actually GDPR applies when working from home as it does in the office. So the same approach should be relevant, and if necessary, provide a copy of your GDPR policies and remind them, maybe run some refresher training, whatever it needs. Your employees need to understand that they need to, within the circumstances, continue to work securely and appropriately for work, in a way that doesn't endanger the personal data, and those dangers you can identify in your data protection impact assessment and tell your employees about some of these risks. So make sure your employees fully get that just because they're working from home, whether it's on in a dedicated office, home office, or on the kitchen table, GDPR still applies to your data, because they will not be the ones who get into trouble if something happens. If an employee causes a data breach for whatever reason and you get investigated, it would be the company that gets the fine for not being able to show that their employees should have known better, or not providing the technology or the solutions to enable the employee to work securely and safely with data from home. Document everything. The accountability principle really requires you to demonstrate your compliance, and the best way of that is document your approach. So have a home working policy, something that sets out how you will approach home working, what your expectations are, set out a process of the things you're going to do. You know, if you're going to be reviewing hardware, reviewing security protocols, what you've put in place to make sure that you've done everything you can to support your employees so that they can work from home, and so forth. If you have it in documentary evidence, you can use that as evidence should you ever be questioned, that you've at least paid it some attention, and that you've done the best you possibly could. And that could be the difference between a telling off and a fine, to be honest. And you'll need to keep this all under review. The situation with the pandemic is changing regularly. You might suddenly have a need that you might be working in an area where everybody gets told they've got to work from home again, or whatever. You need to keep everything under review and make sure it ties in with what the information commissioner, the regulators say, or indeed the way that you might be working. Obviously, you don't need to maintain a working from home policy if it turns out that everybody ends up working back in the office at some point. That point, again, I said before, one of the key things is that it is a new normal in one way or another, but now the excuses of doing your best isn't an excuse for non-compliance. You need to get this right. So that's working from home. Now, one of the things that's changing with people working from home is they're communicating differently. They may be sharing data in different ways than they may have done in the office. They may be talking about customers or situations or sales in a different environment. They might be talking to customers over the phone, providing support or sales or whatever, and they may be discussing personal data, and in which case, that all goes back to all of the security of that data. So again, a data protection impact assessment, which is the bottom square there, is a key tool to enable you to understand what the risks are from using different communication services that you might be using, and make sure that you address those risks. So in the kind of thing I'm talking about here is that people might be using email more than they normally would. Rather than say, come and over, look at my screen, I need to show you something, which they could do in the office, they might be emailing a piece of data. So is your email system secure? Is the way that they share data acknowledged that it should be locked down with a password if it's personal data, or encrypted, or however, or even that you don't believe that email is an appropriate means to transfer data? They may also be using other messaging apps. So your employees will possibly have WhatsApp on their phone, or they might have Facebook Messenger, or any of the other types of messaging services that most people use these days. If they're using those to communicate about work things, what happens if that becomes personal data through those systems? And often those systems are built for consumers and don't afford the same kind of data protection, as it were, for businesses. So WhatsApp, for example, has a business offering, but it's not a business chat offering. It's something else. And they offer, and if you look at their terms, they're very clear that they don't offer any assurances about the compliance of their product, and it's not intended to be used for business purposes. So if you've got employees exchanging data or having conversations about customers or whatever through these messaging platforms, you need to make sure that you lock down what you believe to be acceptable in terms of the platforms and the means, and also understand the implications of, if you're exchanging through email, you will have that email server backed up. If you're using Office 365, then Microsoft takes care of that, and you can always recover anything that might be lost. If you lose a conversation because it happened on WhatsApp and WhatsApp decided to delete an account or not keep that information, you don't have that backup resilience either. So yeah, be careful in the way that messages are being exchanged, how personal data is being exchanged, what mechanisms, what media are being used, and be careful to be clear to your employees, just like we were saying before, about making sure they understand GDPR applies out of the office as much as it does in the office, and that they are clear on what is an appropriate way of sharing personal data. There's also a question, I've mentioned it before, about who might be listening, who could be listening to the conversation you might be having, and that might be somebody else that's living in the same place where your employee is working. And as I said, they just need to see a screen, or they need to hear something that relates to, I was talking to Fred Bloggs about his customer problem and it's led to this, that's a breach of personal data if that other person is paying attention to what they're hearing. And I got asked this question. I got Alexa in that list there. I got asked this question the other day, actually. If you've got a smart speaker or some device that's listening that you can talk to, so hey Google or hey Siri or the Alexa devices, then they are potentially listening to what's going on. So you might want to have a policy in place that says that those working places shouldn't have those kind of devices that are turned on while they're working and discussing customer or other personal data matters, because potentially you're sharing that data with in Alexa's case, with Amazon, and they might not specifically be doing something with them, but you've got that security risk, you've got that processing angle that you may not have considered before. So best things to set out, as I said, carry out a data protection impact assessment to assess the risks and how you're going to mitigate them. Implement an internal communications policy that sets out to your employees what you will accept them using for talking about business in general, but also particularly if they've got to share personal data. You know, send a meeting request and have a conversation on the phone may be a better answer than trying to email data to somebody, or telling them to look at a customer record might be better than trying to forward them the data via some other kind of messaging means. And absolutely, as before, provide guidance, keep your employees up to date, make sure they understand the risks themselves so that they can put those into place. Now, of course, one of the other things that we haven't talked about that people are doing much more on is video conferencing. As I said before, Zoom seems to be the video conferencing platform of choice, but of course you've got Google Hangouts, you've got Microsoft Teams, and there's Ring Central and various other platforms that operate along the same kind of lines. Now, Zoom particularly got picked on early on in the lockdown because of its past history with some security issues, and there were lots of people which the media got hold of saying that Zoom wasn't an appropriate platform to be running government briefings and things, because that's what they were using. Certainly, I don't know if they still do, but initially they were doing that when they were talking to the media or running cabinet meetings, and the government came under criticism. You do need to think very carefully about what you're going to be using it for. You need to be clear that if you're, if you were, for example, a doctor using Zoom to carry out a medical exam, or in terms of not obviously a physical medical exam, a virtual Q&A with a potential patient to talk about their symptoms and what how you might be able to help them, which of course Matt Hancock, the health secretary, was saying the other day, going to your doctors may be a Zoom doctor more in the future, just by way of efficiency, let alone because of coronavirus. If you're in a situation where you're going to be talking and exchanging particularly sensitive or special category data, you need to be very mindful of what that means, particularly if you're recording the session, or if the data is going through a Chinese server, because that's what the configuration is set up by default in the application you're running, or whatever. So definitely be mindful of what you're using. Understand what hosting a Zoom meeting means for you, what that means for the people who are joining, what that means in terms of you configuring the platform to best meet your requirements. Don't record a meeting if you don't have to. If you do have to, make sure everybody understands that if you are recording the whole thing, that you will see in the recording, depending on where that recording is disseminated, they might see the names of the people who are attending, depending on how they got their profile set up, or they might see the actual imagery of people. Make sure people understand that they've got their camera on, they'll be able to be seen, they'll be in a recording potentially. People moving around in the background will also be seen, what's on your walls could be seen, and so forth. So it's more about not so much, yes, you do need to worry about whether you can trust the platform, and this can be said about everybody, whether you're using GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting, Zoom, Teams, or whatever. How can you be sure that the discussion that you're having, the recording, where it's being stored and processed, for example, are all GDPR compliant and secure? You can say that about all of those platforms. So it's about mitigating that risk, which is why, again, a data protection impact assessment will help you identify what the risks are, put in place appropriate actions. So, for example, hopefully when you registered for through Eventbrite, you would have seen the notice saying, please note this is being run by Zoom. We will be recording, but it will only be the presentation that will be distributed, but you will be noticed by your name, and if you have your camera turned on, your image and so forth. This is about making sure people understand when they're participating that there are things going on. It shouldn't be any surprise to anybody to then find out actually that image that they had as the as the off-camera image wasn't an appropriate one for work, but it now appears in a company video that's been put on LinkedIn or on YouTube or whatever. So understand what it means to you as a host, understand what it means to the attendees so that they understand exactly what's going on, some of the things they might want to think about, and so forth. Don't record unless you need to, and assess the risk of what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, and whether video conferencing is indeed the most appropriate way to have conversations, particularly if there's special category data or company sensitive data, but personal data in general as well. So that's working from home, using different technologies for messaging and communicating, including video conferencing. There's a lot of businesses that are adapting to the new way of working. There's a lot of businesses that are doing additional things that they didn't do before. Couple that in with the fact that GDPR was in May this year 2 years old, and some organizations possibly haven't looked at their GDPR compliance in that time since it came into play. Now is an excellent time for you to look at your business and your data processing activities and make sure that you are in fact still GDPR compliant. But if you have changed your business, there's a chance that your record of data processing activities won't be up to date. You might need additional policies. We've already been talking about all these different policies that you might want to get put in place because of a new way of working, for example. But if you're looking at rolling out something online because you're not getting people in physical stores, or people are getting used to buying online more than going down the high street or whatever, then you need to think about what you're going to be doing going forward, how personal data interacts with that, and what your data protection compliance obligations and challenges will be. Again, a data protection impact assessment will help you understand those risks. There's a template on the Information Commissioner's website which you can follow, which gives you questions that hopefully will generate a thought pattern for you to consider what those risks are, and then you can think about how you're going to mitigate those risks. There are some other compliance required things relating to how they work, but essentially a DPIA is a data protection impact assessment is a risk assessment. And this is all part of a concept which isn't new to the UK, because the ICO advocated it prior to GDPR coming in, but is a new concept in data protection law, which is the concept of data protection by design and by default. So if you're going to be doing something new, you should make sure that you consider data protection at the outset. Don't let it be an afterthought. Use a data protection impact assessment to help you understand what that might look like from a compliance risk perspective. And if it's a digital system or some kind of functionality which you offer to third parties like customers, which there may be various privacy options, make sure that they are enabled by default in the most privacy protecting kind of way. So if there are privacy settings in an app, for example, that you decided to launch, those privacy settings should be turned in favor of the individual that's using the app first, regardless of whether you're trying to convince them to switch it over or whatever. But data protection by design and default as a concept has to apply. You're doing something different, you should consider data protection from the outset. Use a data protection impact assessment to consider what those risks might be. Have a look at your GDPR compliance, because you will, if you're doing something different, as I said before, be looking at probably needing to update your register of data processing activities, i.e. what you're recording, how you're processing it, why it's lawful, where it's being stored, and all these kind of things. Make sure that any documentation you have is reflective of what's changed, whether that's because you're launching a new way of working, or because you've had to pivot your business, or because you've just not paid attention to GDPR for the last couple of years. And make sure that your employees are up to date with what's going on as well. So, that last square there, have your employees changed? That may be that they're doing things differently, so they might need to have more training about how their new role is impacted by GDPR, whether that's working from home or working in a different part of the business. But it's also about, you may have lost some employees, you might have got some new ones in. Have they been trained? Are they aware of the company policies? Those kind of things. So you need to be able to show that you're doing something different, but you took GDPR compliance along with you while you were implementing that, and that's at the heart of what data protection by design and default is about. So if your business has changed in any way, either because of coronavirus or not, or you're offering a different product, service, different way of working, whatever, you're going to have to carry out these things. Make sure that you're compliant. Use a risk assessment to determine what the risks are and mitigate those risks. Make sure your employees are up to date and aware of what has changed, or for them that they've received training and refresher, and just reflect on what might have changed about your business. And then finally, if you are having your employees come back to work and you're looking at potentially maybe testing their temperature, then you need to think very carefully about what you're going to be doing, because any information that is health related is considered a special category of data. Not only do you need a lawful basis for processing, but you have to have a special condition. So there's an Article 9 condition in GDPR terms that will need to apply that makes it lawful for you to be processing that special category of data. But I think the key thing is there's nothing wrong with testing your employees to make sure that they haven't got a temperature when they come into work. It's what you do with that information after. And if you're doing any kind of recording, as opposed to somebody walks in the office, they get zapped with a temperature reader, and then if it's not a high temperature, they're allowed to go in, otherwise they get sent home, but you don't record anything, you probably have to worry less. But if you are keeping it in a logbook, so you've got evidence for health and safety or whatever, then you have to be very clear as to why you're recording that information and what you're going to be doing with it, and you will need to apply the GDPR principles. You also need to make sure your employees understand what you're going to be doing with that. How long you're going to retain that data. Are you keeping it for the NHS test and trace process, particularly if you're in the hospitality, for example? Then the question is, what's a relevant time period? I can't off the top of my head remember what the hospitality industry has said. I think it's 21 days for test and trace. Contact data. If you're keeping it for those kind of purposes, then you need to have very clear policies about retention, making sure it gets deleted securely, make sure employees understand what's going on, and if necessary, as always, carry out a data protection impact assessment, make sure you've got proper processing, you've updated your inventory or record of processing activities, that you've got proper policies in place, that you're not leaving the data lying around on a registration thing on the front desk, so that anybody who comes into the front desk can see that Fred Bloggs came in today and he had a normal temperature, or whatever it is that you're asking them to record. So you'll need specific processes around this. You do need to be careful about how you're doing it. If you've got automated like CCTV heat seeking cameras that can determine people's temperature while they're working and alert you to that on an automatic basis or whatever, then there are lots of controls in place around monitoring employees' behaviours and using that kind of technology or any kind of automated decision making as well. And finally, be very careful about who you're giving away the information to. I mean, obviously, if an employee rings in sick and says, I've been tested positive, I need to self-isolate, you need to tell my little team. It won't be too difficult for the little team to work out which employee it is, but don't give stuff away unnecessarily. And if you do get asked by the authorities, make sure it really is the authorities that are asking and that they are allowed to be provided with that information. So ultimately have a process and procedure in place around all of this, and obviously protect the data. You need to be clear on why you're doing it, have a very specific purpose, make sure you meet the GDPR requirements, particularly around lawfulness of processing. You can't be relying on consent, because that's not an appropriate lawful basis when you're dealing with employees. It's probably going to be a legitimate interest that you do it, or possibly a legal obligation if there's a reason why the law tells you you've got to do this. So those were the 4 key scenarios I wanted to cover. In terms, I guess in summarising, what should you be doing now? Well, here's 10 things that you should be thinking about. 1, top of the list, data protection impact assessments. Carry out a risk assessment, determine what the risks are from what you're doing, whether that's using different communication channels, employees working from home, new business, testing employees as they come into the office. Data protection impact assessment is a key tool to help you identify the risks and how you're going to address those risks and fix them so that they're not a GDPR compliance issue. Number two, review your existing GDPR compliance and make sure it is relevant and accurate and up to date. So that might be looking at your record of data processing activities and updating that accordingly to what might have changed. Re-educate your employees, make sure they understand that GDPR applies all time, whether they're working from home or not, whether they're in the office or not, GDPR applies, and put in place processes that will work for you from a compliance point of view, but also for your employees. And with that in mind, number four there, have a set of policies set up for your employees to understand what you expect from them when they're working from home. And that can be anything from the technology they use to basic security, handling of data remotely, what technology is allowed, and so forth. You may also need policies around the different communication channels. You might have an acceptable use policy for using online messaging services, what you should or shouldn't be doing if you're using Zoom or other video conferencing. Make sure you have an internal process if you are going to be testing employees, and be very clear about the purpose. Keep up to date as things change. There is quite a lot of resources on the ICO's website that changes from time to time, so it's worth keeping an eye on that. Keep everything under review and adjust accordingly, particularly if guidance comes in that sort of changes some ways of thinking about things, or if you find out that the video conferencing channel you're using has got a major security flaw and you don't want your employees to use it, you need to be able to adapt and adjust accordingly. Don't forget the accountability principle actually in law requires you to maintain your compliance and be able to demonstrate you're maintaining your compliance. So this all fits in with a regular review, and I'd suggest that the minimum once a year, maybe once a year or once every other year as a very minimum approach to doing that. But arguably, depending on your processing activities, you might need to do it more regularly than that, because the key thing is that you maintain and continue to be compliant all of the time. And finally, document everything. The more you document, the more evidence you will have to demonstrate, should you need to, that you've taken this all seriously and you've paid attention to the GDPR obligations, and you've done the best you can. And as I said before, that could be the difference between a telling off and a fine, or a large fine and a small fine. So 10 things to take away and an action if you haven't already been thinking about these things. But of course, I'm here to help. If you need any help, I provide GDPR support services. And the core offering is my GDPR Unlimited product, which gives you unlimited email and phone support. It gives you hands-on help. You get up to four hours of hands-on help, so I can do some of the work for you. So if you are looking at some of these and thinking we need somebody to come in and assess whether we're doing the right thing, then that's the kind of thing that I can help you do. And in fact, I've got a review and do offering at the moment, which is a 3-month subscription to the GDPR Unlimited helpline. And across that 3 months, I'll review your GDPR compliance, write up what it is you need to do, and help you implement that as well. But yeah, if you want to have a talk and find out how I can help you, then feel free to get in touch. But there's a link there on the bottom of that slide, which is a link to the services I offer. And to answer a question, would it be possible to share it by email? Yes, I'll be sending out an email later this afternoon, which will have a link to where you can download the slides and review the recording of the presentation. So that's not a problem. And if you want to refresh or learn more about the complexities of data protection, I'm starting tomorrow a new 10-week GDPR weekly workout program. So this is training, looking at some of the detail of GDPR in a lot more detail than kind of a summary presentation, a bit like what I've run through today. So tomorrow the session is free and is actually a GDPR refresh and review. I think it's 10:30 or 10 o'clock. You can find the link on my website, or you can find it on Eventbrite. The ones after that are chargeable, but there's a discount and a spreading of the cost over a few months if you want to sign up for all 10, or you can just dip in and out with the ones that you're particularly interested in. But for example, we'll talk about the lawful basis for processing non-EEA data processing and what Privacy Shield invalidity means and so forth. So yeah, if you or ping me an email if you want to know a bit more about that.
Which leads us to questions. So I just had that one question came in about whether they could have a copy of the slides. I don't know whether anybody wants to ask any other questions either through chat or in person. What I'll do is I'll stop the screen share and stop the recording, and then